Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to ISR's first ever virtual film screening. Our film this evening is the documentary The Atom, A Love Story. This film was due to have a cinematic release last year, but like many things, it was thwarted by COVID. However, cinema's loss is our gain, and we're very pleased to be supporting this event this evening. For those who don't know or know me, my name is Jo Crotty and I'm a professor at Edge Hill University and director of ISR, or the Institute for Social Responsibility. ISR works to advance research, knowledge exchange and public engagement within the broadest conceptualizations of social responsibility. And I can therefore not imagine a more appropriate topic for our first film screening, that of the atom and its impact on our society from the Manhattan Project to the present day. So first of all, I would like to introduce Vicki Lesley. Vicki has been working in documentaries for over 20 years. She has developed and made top-rated and award-winning TV shows for broadcasters, including the BBC, Channels 4 and 5, Discovery and National Geographic, and directed independent short films which have been screened at festivals around the world. She's also the director of tonight's film, as I already mentioned. Second, I would like to introduce Dr. Philippa Holloway, currently a lecturer at the Department of English History and Creative Writing at Edge Hill University. Philippa is a writer and an academic with a special interest in nuclear psychogeography. Her short fiction has been published on 4 continents, and her debut novel, The Half-Life of Snails, is due for publication next spring. As research for this novel explores the legacy of Chernobyl and the current impact of nuclear power on rural communities, Philippa travelled to Ukraine to spend some time in Chernobyl's nuclear exclusion zone. Philippa is also the writer in residence at Hat Green secret nuclear bunker near Nantwich. So you will have the opportunity to meet both Vicki and Philippa after we've watched the film. But without further ado, I'm now asking you to dim your lights, pass your popcorn around and settle down to watch tonight's feature, The Atom, A Love Story. See you again at 2030. Right, welcome back everybody, and I've never seen the chat so animated, so that's good. I'm so glad that you enjoyed it. I did too. It was fascinating, though I do wonder, because of the failure of successive governments to invest in renewables, whether we actually have any choice about nuclear power now, but maybe we can bring that up in a moment. So I'm going to hand over to Philippa and Vicki for a bit now, and they're going to have a quick chat. I think Philippa's going to ask Vicki some questions about how she went about making the film, and that'll give me a time to go through the myriad of chats and pull out some of the questions for our director. So I'll hand over to you two for a couple of minutes.
Hi, thank you so much, Jo. First of all, I'd like to say a huge thank you to the ISR for hosting tonight, and for Vicki giving up her time. Jo, Danny, you've been amazing putting this event together, which so far technologically has been smooth. This is where I curse it. And I'm really looking forward to talking to Vicki. We've had a few chats before, but it's such a fantastic film. I've seen it a couple of times now, and there's always something new that I can find in the film to think about. One of the first questions I want to talk about is your research, because as you know, I did my PhD looking into nuclear power stations, visiting nuclear power stations and writing about nuclear power stations. And when I was doing my research, I would be in conversation with somebody, and then they'd find out I was a writer, and suddenly they would shut down or start talking to me in a different way, almost as if they were worried that as a writer I was somehow going to cause problems for them, or they couldn't disclose things to me. And yet your film has got so many people in the industry to open up and be really honest about their feelings, their experiences, their beliefs, both pro and anti-nuclear. Can you talk a little bit about that process of interviewing people and how you got them to talk to you?
Yeah, well, that was so interesting when you told me that, because I get, maybe I'm just hugely charming, not to say that you're charming. I'm
hugely threatening.
I mean, I don't know. When I first contacted people, this film was a very long time in the gestation, so it kind of went through lots of different iterations. But when we were doing the main bulk of the interviews, it had a working title, which was what I was telling the people I was contacting. The working title was The Greatest Story Ever Sold. So the love affair thing what hadn't been thought of at that time, and it was, but the approach was very much that I was looking at the way the story around nuclear power had changed all these different ways, which is obviously still fundamentally in the film as it is now. But it was a little bit more of an angle with the sort of the PR, the different arguments for nuclear. And it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I contacted people with an email generally, first of all. I saw that somebody asked how I contacted Ralph Nader. I actually, embarrassingly, I couldn't remember. I've just gone back and looked into my emails to find out how I contacted him. And it was through a guy who wrote a book, which I thoroughly recommend, called Toxic Sludge is Good for You. And I think the subtitle is something like Lies, Damn Lies in the PR Industry, but it has a chapter in that book about nuclear PR. So I had contacted him and we had a big chat, and he said, like, I think Ralph Nader would be really interested in this. And so it was through him. And it was actually, that was a very straightforward one, although the interview with him, one or two of the interviews were extremely short. Well, they weren't extremely short, but relative to the other interviews. And I think we had, like, I can't remember, 45 minutes or something with Ralph Nader. He's been interviewed, he was very, very polished and practiced with what he said. So, we didn't, some of the other people, it took a long time to kind of go around the houses and to get people to warm up and feel comfortable to talk. And I think as well, it's a thing in documentary filmmaking, in a way, the most interesting people are the people who have never talked before, and they're sort of slightly surprised that you're interested in them.
Did you find there was a difference between the people in the UK and the people abroad? So when I went to Chernobyl, I found people were so open, so eager to talk.
Yes.
Everybody I spoke to in Ukraine, everybody I spoke to on site in the exclusion zone, everybody I met just welcomed me, and they wanted to tell their stories. They wanted to share their experiences, their knowledge. And yet in the UK, when I went to visit a nuclear power station, the new site for the second nuclear power station in Anglesey, I managed to get a tour of the proposed site by the site manager. But after a couple of hours of traveling around the site and talking, when it came out that I was writing a book, he very quickly offered me a job, so long as I would sign a non-disclosure agreement, which would have stopped me doing my PhD and writing or publishing the book. So it was almost like everyone else was willing to talk, but in the UK, there was this need to control the narrative. Did you find it different?
One thing I would say is that because I was really making a historical film, generally the people I was contacting were people who were not in the industry anymore. And so I think that did give them a freedom to talk. But, and at various points I thought about, I thought about contacting people from EDF. I thought about contacting an energy minister, and I'm so glad I didn't, because there's been about 500 million of them, and whoever it was, I would have interviewed. Like, no, I wouldn't remember who they are. And I came to realise that none of the energy ministers really know that much about it, because they come in for a really short time and then they roll off to another department. So I didn't speak to really anybody very current, and partly because I had this rule fairly early on that as much as it was possible to do it, obviously going back into the 50s, there was no one who was still alive, but as soon as I could, I wanted to speak to people who actually were in there and were doing stuff. So there were three people in the film, to the best of, Tony Benn is no longer alive. To the best of my knowledge, there were three people in their 90s that I interviewed. I was going to say, to the best of my knowledge, they're still alive. I mean, they may not. Certainly the American, Mike McCormick, who was the American congressman, was, I think, 93 when I interviewed him, which was in 2013. So, but periodically I have a look and see, and Marcel Boiteau, the French guy from EDF, was, I believe, 94 when I personally didn't interview him, because I had an amazing researcher helping me with some of the French and German, finding the French and German people. But I don't have, I did like French, German GCSE, but certainly not to the level that I could discuss the history of nuclear power with anybody. And Marcel Boiteau, I was sure would no longer be alive, because he was very old. And it was a feature of my research that I would read about some really, really interesting person and Google them and then find their obituary, But But there's this wonderful French thing that, despite being in his 90s and having retired, 20 years ago or something, he still had I don't know if he, I actually don't know if he's still alive, but he had his own office still at EDF in Paris and his own secretary.
Wow.
And my researcher sort of found him, and he was delighted to speak to us. But when we found him, I was so worried of how old he was, and I was just about to have my first baby. And I was so worried that he might not make it through my maternity leave that I sent the crew out and my researcher kind of with my questions, and they did the interview when my baby was 3 weeks old, because I was so nervous that we might sort of lose him. So I didn't do that. That was the one interview that I didn't do. Well, I mean, wasn't there in person. There was a couple of the German interviews that I, again, didn't do well. The Jürgen Trittin, who was the German politician, my translator, again, like, we were booked for a certain amount of time with him. He was having to read a bill somewhere in the German parliament, he had to be in a certain room to read it, and the time ticked away. So by the time he came, like, she just had to, I couldn't even chip in. But I mean, I was at least in the room for that one. And my German's better than my French, so I was able to follow more or less what they were saying. Yeah, to go back to your question about the difference in the British people and the American people, I mean, I don't know, probably partly that's cultural. The American, it's a cliche, but I think Americans are just more open. I do also wonder if there is something. I mean, I've done a lot of filming in America sort of throughout my sort of TV career on other things, and I always found that they just they fall in love with the British accent. And I think when I was quite heavily pregnant, I was 6 months pregnant when I did that American filming trip. So I went in there with my big baby bump and my nice English accent. And I think a lot of the elderly gentlemen that I was interviewing just sort of thought I was rather sweet, and that may have been
non-threatening.
Yeah, exactly. And to be honest, at that time in particular, it was a little bit of I was sort of mildly obsessed with this notion, which I come to at the end of the film, about the kind of differing worldviews. And, is there something about kind of the type of person that you are? Does that sort of predispose you to have a feeling one way or the other? And that, it's not to say that being one type of person or another is better or worse. It's just different. And I was really, really interested in that, because I felt like I was so almost like the stereotype of the anti-nuclear person. I was female, I'm sort of lefty, I was a sort of arty person, I was heavily pregnant, I was the mother figure and all of these things. And I asked a lot of these old guys about that, and I mean, actually that was the genesis. I think that those conversations were the genesis of where that love affair thing came from later, because I talked to them a lot. I was trying to tease out from them what their emotion was about nuclear power, and they were quite often quite baffled even by this line of questioning. It just wasn't, they didn't see emotion as something that was anything to do with them. Emotion was very much something that was in the anti-nuclear world, and not in a good way.
That comes across so well, that the people who did work in the nuclear industry, who were telling their stories, did have a really strong emotional connection with it, a sense of pride, something for their community, a sense of community within the nuclear industry as well. And I think that's quite interesting that you managed to tease that out, because like you say, there is this idea that if you're investigating something, particularly as a sort of a liberal woman, you would automatically be seen as anti-nuclear. And I know when I went into my research, I'd gone from being quite anti-nuclear when I was young to trying to deliberately bring myself to a point where I was completely sitting on the fence. I wanted my research to be fair, to be balanced, to give a chance to everybody who I spoke to give a chance in the story, to let effectively in my book, to let the reader decide based on the events how they felt about nuclear power, not to put forward an agenda in my own narrative, which I've been assured it does allow the reader to make up their mind. But it's quite hard when you're also researching the nuclear industry, especially with me researching nuclear accidents. It's hard then not to find yourself being swayed back into an anti-nuclear stance.
I mean, I was very, very open. I always said that.
Educated perspective. So now, for example, my anti-nuclear stance would be based on the finances, the science, the history, the facts and figures, rather than memories of Chernobyl or any fears and anxiety I have. So it's a different kind of standpoint that I have now. Did you find something similar with
very, very similar
journey?
I went in and I was very open, and I said, I'm a Greenpeace activist, that's sort of my background. was somebody who didn't know very much about nuclear power, but would be instinctively kind of wary of it. I was, you know, at school when Chernobyl happened, and it was scary, and, you know, so I was very, very open about kind of who I was and where I was situated in that. But I was also kind of, I'm not terribly interested in a way, or I certainly wasn't at that point. I wasn't very interested in what I thought about it, because I have had nothing to do with nuclear power. I was interested in what they thought about it. And I guess that came across in the interviews. It was almost like slightly by accident that I ended up making a film on this subject. I was kind of having a bit of a, you know, about to turn 30 crisis in working in telly, and feeling like a lot of things I was making were a bit silly. And, you know, I made a show about UFOs, and I made another show about ASBOs, if we remember those, which was pretty horrible. It was kind of sort of laughing really at people with mental health problems looking back on it. But I just was like not that happy in TV, and I thought I want to go and make something that's a bit more meaningful and more serious. And to be honest, it was really quite at random that this was a subject that was kind of in the news around this time. It was around the beginnings of this kind of nuclear renaissance Blair was sort of pushing for. And, you know, obviously I had absolutely no idea I would go on to spend like over 10 years making a film about it, but I never got bored of it. I always found more and more. I mean, the first edit of this film was 4.5 hours. You know, I had enough material 100% to make like a 6-part series on it. But, you know,
we're eagerly anticipating the sequel. I'm very aware that you and I could probably talk for about another 8 hours. There are some amazing questions coming through.
There really are.
So important that the guests.
There really are some great questions. I mean, you're right. We could have another seminar on this on it alone. Anyway, thanks to Daniel Gordon, who has looked up Marcel Boito, and he is still alive, or at least.
Great.
You have to keep looking up these people like Henry.
That's what I'd be doing every so often. They're on Wikipedia. If they had have died, it would say on Wikipedia.
Someone would know. So a very interesting question, actually, right at the beginning. I think Tom Bishop, who was asking about the sort of, have we frozen? Have I frozen? No. Okay, good. About the health impacts on people who worked in the nuclear industry, and whether or not you managed to capture that in some of your interviews.
Not really. I made a bit of a decision fairly early on. I just sort of steer a little bit away from stuff about radiation and cancer risks and things, partly just because I felt like it had been quite well covered, you know, in other areas, but also because I felt like it's hard. It's one of those areas where it's hard to prove, you know, people will give facts on both sides, and my partner is actually a radiation health physicist, a medical physicist in the NHS. So he's a real expert in radiation, and I talked with him a lot about it, and it's a good area in a way. I'll also talk to Walt Patterson about this, who's, you know, spent decades sort of researching and interacting with the nuclear industry, and he is a physicist by training. And he said, you know, it's not by accident often that the industry, like they're comfortable to set. So it's a good area for them, because you can't ever, you know, you can never prove that an individual cancer case has come from the fact that you live near the nuclear power station. You know, there are clusters and there are arguments. I mean, there's arguments for sure. I mean, I'm sure Philippa has probably looked into this much more than I have. But, you know, the arguments about I did talk to Harold Bolter, the Sellafield guy, about the cases around Windscale and Sellafield. And, you know, he said, well, there's a good case to be made that it's just an influx of workers that have come to the area who've brought in, you know, other things, or a different gene pool or whatever. It's very, very hard to ever prove anything one way or the other, which is whereas, as Philippa said, like, I got more and more interested in the kind of, I suppose, stuff that you really could get a grasp on and not argue with, so the economics, sort of political stuff. Because I don't know. So I didn't really go into the health impacts too greatly, I would say.
I think there was another question about decommissioning and whether or not you were going to do
people keep asking me for a sequel. It's taken me to do this one, but
well, what I would say is, when you're a student of economics, Econ 101, your first day, the use of nuclear power station as an example, it's really expensive to build, it's really cheap to run, and it's prohibitively expensive to decommission. And they always, that is the typical economics 101 answer. And I really enjoyed that. Actually, they showed that at the beginning. It was like, oh, you could just have these turnkey ones. Oh no, you couldn't. They were crazy money. But did you get, although you haven't made the documentary on decommissioning, you must have got into some of those conversations?
Yeah, well, I haven't made it, but I did actually, before I made the Atom, I did make a series of short films about different aspects of nuclear, because for a while I had an idea that I was going to make a kind of a longer film stitched together by different sort of shorter films, but I kind of abandoned that idea at a certain point. But one of the short films I did make was at Dounreay in Scotland, which is an experimental reactor, and I think is the, after Sellafield, you know, is the most complex and most expensive decommissioning site in this country. And specifically, I think it is on Vimeo. I'll see if I can send the link to you guys to send out afterwards if people want to watch it. It's quite old now. I filmed it in 2007, I think. But it was looking at two things. Basically, a whole load of problems have come out at that site, where there was when they were building, it's classic of the whole, it's sort of emblematic in a way of how decommissioning just was not thought of at the time. When they were constructing the power station, they had this big tunnel that just went out to the sea, like a kind of construction tunnel. When the site was finished, they asked the government of the day, could they use this tunnel to just send, waste out into the sea? And they said, oh yeah, fine. So there are now all these just little bits of radioactive fuel washing back up on this beach next to Dounreay. So we filmed, they have to go out with this big kind of, it looks a bit like a sort of steamroller thing, but with a huge Geiger counter on the front, just up and down this sand. And then if it goes off, they have to get out by hand. It's like literally, in a grain of sand. These things are so tiny, but they're, it's highly radioactive fuel, particles. So there's all these fuel particles washing in, and they're on the seabed, so they can't have any fishing. And then the other thing is there's this construction shaft. They just dumped a load of radioactive waste, but also chemical waste, just all sorts of crap in there, basically. And and then just put a big concrete plug on the top of it. In the 1970s, all this gas and everything that had built up in there over the 20 odd years, it just blew up. Like the concrete plug just blew out. And all what was in there, it wasn't lined, it was a construction shaft. It hadn't been built to store waste in specifically. So it's all just like seeped into the groundwater. So I filmed with the engineers who were dealing with the trying to make good this construction shaft. And it was just sort of mind blowing, because it wasn't even, neither of those things were really directly about actually decommissioning like the actual reactor. These were just other things that had happened when the place was being built. And they were all very phlegmatic about it. And it's like, well, it's going to take kind of, 50 years and this many hundreds of millions of pounds to make it good. And the timescales are quite extraordinary. I suppose it is it's the future of the industry, isn't it? Basically decommissioning. And I think that is where increasingly the Nuclear Decommissioning Agency here, the budget for that is absolutely enormous. I think
is phenomenal.
It's incredible, and it's presumably only going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, isn't it, as time goes on.
I did a sneaky thing and managed to get into a nuclear decommissioning workshop in Liverpool by not telling them I was a writer. I told them I was a nuclear psychogeographist, so they thought I was one of them, I think. And listening to the panel presentations, which were, there were experts going in talking about how they developed a laser for £2 million that could cut up a piece of nuclear waste from being this big to being this big, so it was easier to store. And the phenomenal amount of money that was being spent on fixing the problems of nuclear power stations that were not designed with decommissioning in mind. Wylfa is a really good example of that. They've actually worked out that it's cheaper just to staff and guard Wylfa for the next 50 years than it is to start decommissioning it, because it's built the wrong way round. It's not built in a way where you can easily take out the fuel and start taking it apart from the inside out, which is what you need to do with a nuclear power station. You can't start at the outside and work in. You have to remove the waste first. And the reactors are just not built in a way that makes that possible unless you develop new technologies to get in there and start decommissioning them from the inside out. So it is, in terms of the cost, it's absolutely, it's billions and billions of pounds, which then when you add that on top of the unit price for electricity, it just doesn't make any financial sense. It's not economically viable.
That's completely, that's the journey I went on, really.
As well as there's still no consensus on what to do with the waste. That's the next generation's problem, or the next generation's problem, which your film brilliantly explained, that whole idea of it's always going to be someone else who steps in and takes over.
Well, there are two questions. We've only got about 5 minutes left. Two questions on the actual process of the film more than its content, I think. One, how did you get Ralph Nader? And two,
I think I answered that,
and secondly, I can't remember the name of the Crispin, what's his surname? Crispin
Aubrey.
Who is he?
Crispin Aubrey was a journalist and a renewable energy advocate, I think. He was also like one of the best, like a best friend from school, I think, of Christopher Hurd, who's the producer of my co-producer, my executive producer. And when I was researching this film for like a really long time, Crispin wrote a book about, so Hinkley C, that is being built now in Somerset, there was previously like a big inquiry and a big sort of battle in, I think it was the late 80s, to build, effectively Hinkley C, but not the Hinkley C we've got now. And Crispin and his family live in Somerset, really close to Hinkley. And so he had written a whole book about that planning inquiry. And I'd contacted him. I actually didn't know that he knew Christo when I first contacted him. I think it came out in that phone call in a sort of one of those sort of bizarre, sort of serendipitous connections. But he was incredibly helpful. I mean, to be honest, everybody I spoke to was wonderfully helpful and gave me loads of time, but as was Crispin. And then he very sadly very suddenly died. And it was very, very, very sad for Christo. It was sad. I felt very sad. I hadn't met Crispin. We had talked about that I was going to go down to Somerset and meet him and possibly interview him. But then his family set up a trust in his name, and it was to support sort of journalism and the intersection, I think, of journalism and renewable energy. I think I can't remember that specifically, but basically they gave us some money to help with completing the film. The film itself was finished basically in 2017, but because there's absolutely tons of archive in it, we had a bill of kind of £50,000 plus to clear all that archive, and that was very, very difficult to raise. And actually, it still is not entirely raised. I'm still paying off credit cards for some of that now. But it was during that time that they put this money in, and we just thought it was I was very grateful to him for all of these reasons, and because he had this personal connection to the producer, it was just something we wanted to do to kind of honour him and thank his family, really. And they were very touched. I think they didn't know we were going to do that, so that was really nice when we had the premiere.
Well, I think that wraps it up quite neatly then, because Simon Holloway's asking, when are you selling it to BBC4? So that's your get out.
Unfortunately, BBC4 have turned it down.
Oh no!
No, it's been turned down by everybody in the UK. There is actually a sort of strange shadow version of this film, a TV cut of the film called The Atom and Us, which is narrated by me, with the idea being that generally my voice would be replaced by a local, be dubbed by somebody else, and it doesn't have any of the love affair sort of trappings, and it's 55 minutes long, but that's been sold all over the place to loads and loads of international broadcasters, but not to the UK. It's been turned down.
Okay, so this is an ISR exclusive this evening then, so that's good.
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't been shown that many places because, as you said at the beginning, we were set to be in cinemas last summer, and then obviously COVID happened.
Yes, so sadly COVID ruins everything.
But this is a history film, so my hope is that it should still be relevant. We definitely still want to try and get it up into at least some cinemas.
Great.
Later on.
Well, I'm afraid it is 1 minute to 9.
Yes.
So I'm going to thank Vicki very much for her time for screening the film, for letting ISR have this exclusive look at it. Thank Philippa as well for essentially bringing this idea to me. I think it was absolutely fabulous. And thanks to Danny as well behind the scenes. For
yes, massive thanks to Danny. Yeah.
For all the tech work. I'm so pleased about that. And also thanks to all of you participants for joining us this evening and all your wonderful comments. I've never seen the chat so live.
Yeah, I feel conscious that I've not really answered. I've answered barely any of those questions. I'm totally happy to answer any questions or carry on a conversation over email if anybody wants to contact me.
I think you've put your contact details in the chat, and and if you want to be on,
and I'm on Twitter
and
as well.
If you want to join Vicki's mailing list, you can. And Danny also put the future ISR events in the chat as well. So please do join us. These are all public events and open to all. Thanks very much, everyone. I'm going to go and have a gin and lemonade now. And have a good evening. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.